Well, indeed, his earlier comments, that's the comment of Mr. Godwin Obaseki, Governor of Edo State, on alleged printing of 60 billion naira, was the first comment that generated a response from the CBN governor, which you saw there. Initially, we had heard from the Minister of Finance, who said that wasn't quite correct. But the CBN governor did not say it wasn't correct. He said that, you know, the country is in a bad shape and that the CBN is only doing what it needs to do. However, perhaps to add more, or to put what he was saying in context, the governor of Edo State has also spoken again, talking about just how, you know, delicate our situation is. But we have with us this morning someone who can help shed light on where it is that, you know, we should be going, or what it is we're looking at in terms of funding future budgets. We have with us Mr. Ben Akabweze, who is the Director General of the Budget Office. You're welcome to Sunrise Elite this morning.
Thank you, Mokwe.
We also have with us Mr. Wale Oluwade, who is the CEO of Growth Masters Consulting. You're welcome to Sunrise Daily this morning.
Good morning.
And I also understand that Professor Ken Ife will be joining us. He's a macroeconomic policy analyst. Gentlemen, let me first of all start with you, Mr. Ben Akabweze. When you heard the initial comments, I mean, what have you made of the initial comments of, you know, printing 60 billion naira, the denial, no, we didn't print, and the CBN now saying, look, we're in a bad shape, we only did what we need to do as lender of last resort?
Well, let me explain. I'd hoped that we'll go past this and just focus on what we need to do. But, you know, the truth is, yes, as the central bank governor admitted, there is what is called technically printing money. When you avail government, for instance, if central bank avails government facilities. But the reality is what is shared at FAC is not from what the central bank avails. What is shared at FAC is revenues generated by the revenue generating agencies, okay, which is vetted by the FAC, you know, committee of commissioners and the Accountant General, and they agree that these represent the revenues. You've heard sometimes there's controversy and they say, no, we don't agree. There should be more coming from this agency, stuff like that. Each, you know, tier of government, the federal government takes its own. The reality then is that what federal government gets from FAC is not adequate to meet its own obligations as federal government. And so it resorts to borrowings. And sometimes that borrowing includes borrowing from the central bank. So in truth, as the Minister of Finance said, what is shared at FAC is not the debt money. But, you know, it's not denial that there is what amounts to, you know, money, which also, you know, when the state governors, the governments take their own share and go back, and when they have, you know, they have shortfalls, sometimes they also look up to the central bank for support, as the governor indicated. So I think we need to just clarify, you know, how it happens.
Indeed, that clarification is very important, because what people would like to know is the true situation. For a number of people, I mean, I don't know if you saw how the dailies reflected the minister's words. It became, Obaseki, you lied. You know, it was that somebody wasn't telling the truth somewhere. So if, at the end of the day, they were both correct, you know, that needs to be put out there, that it's just a misinterpretation of how the facts have been put out. That's what you're trying to say, right?
Well, I have clarified the process to you, how it works, okay? At FAC, you know, what's shared is not printed money.
I just wanted I wanted to reiterate it.
Revenues generated by the agencies. But in reality, those revenues currently are not adequate to meet our needs. And so government resorts to borrowing. And that includes the federal government and the state governments. Sometimes that borrowing happens from the central bank. But if everybody approaches the central bank independently, or the governors sometimes, collectively. But the federal government approaches the central bank independently.
That's what I wanted to know, whether they go individually or they go as a collective. In which case, would he also have been correct to say that, oh, the last money we shared was printed by the CBN? I'm just wondering.
Yes, at times there are programs that the central bank avails all of the states, and even then it's not mandatory. It's every state. I remember once, Lagos State opted out, so they didn't need to, the bailout funds, for instance. Okay, so to that extent, ultimately, every state makes its individual decision as to whether or not it wants to borrow. But as to what is shared, everybody gets their share based on the approved revenue allocation formula.
In recent times, though, there have been huge questions about the situation of our debt. The federal government has tried to allay fears that, looking at our debt to GDP ratio, we're still doing okay. But if you look at how much we're expending on debt servicing in our budget, the figure is alarming, you must admit.
Yes, and we've never been shy of admitting that. The Honourable Minister earlier this year made a public presentation on the breakdown in January this year of the 2021 budget. If you refer to it, and your folks were there, put it out clearly that the debt service to revenue ratio was of concern. I have personally made a number of presentations this year, on the budget. I spoke at an ICANN forum on this. I spoke at the Lagos Business School Breakfast Club on this, just among a number of others. And we have never been putting it out there that there is, you can't run away completely from the debt to GDP ratio because it's one of the indicators of debt, sustainability. But it's not the only one. When you look at the debt sustainability analysis that the Debt Management Office does, all of the other factors are taken on board.
What other factors?
It's not even just the size of your debt. The structure of your debt is important. What is the tenor of your debt? What's the mix of your debt between local currency and foreign currency? These are all factors in ultimately determining the sustainability of your debt.
So right now, would you say that our debt is sustainable?
Our debt currently is still sustainable. However, we can't continue at current pace. And so we must fix the core issue, which is our revenues. And that's why that's been the focus of all of the initiatives and the drive on the fiscal side of public finance management.
Where is the thrust of fiscal policy right now? Because I'm sure you're on the same page. Whatever political differences you might have with the governor of Edo State, but I'm sure that you cannot fault what he said about oil and oil being a major source of revenue, dwindling and becoming irrelevant in the nearest future. What are your thoughts in that regard? What's the federal government's projection as to how quickly oil could become irrelevant and what we should be doing in the meantime to ensure that we're not left in the lurch?
Well, when you speak to the experts, the oil and gas industry, they tell you fossil fuels are going to remain relevant in the next 30 to 50 years. But nobody is planning how that long, okay? Because the reality is, you don't know. These things, these are their best estimates. And oil and gas is one area where the best of experts can suddenly be made to look very, very ignorant. The one way to ruin your career as an economist is to bet on price of oil. So what we're doing now is we're saying, look, we need to diversify, and yes, that's become a cliche. For the last 4 decades, everybody's talking about diversification. but we need to really then put action, behind it. But the reality is we currently need oil to diversify away from oil. Unfortunately, our current reality is that oil and gas still accounts for over 90% of foreign exchange. Our current reality is that the industrial and service sector is still heavily import dependent, and oil and gas generates that foreign exchange that you need. So you can't simply shut down that and hope that the other side will go, and which is why whenever oil prices decline, the whole economy suffers. So we've got to create an export-led economy. We've got to create alternative sources of foreign exchange, in addition to simultaneously reducing import dependence as an economy. And for instance, there should be no need for us to be importing food. So if we can eliminate that, that will be a key thing. If we can move to domestic refining of our petroleum products, that will save about 30 to 40% of the current demand for foreign exchange on the market.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Oluwade, let me come to you. You have spoken about, excuse me, how our budget should be structured. You've had your own ideas about how budget should be structured. Looking at the fact that we're now in a pretty delicate situation, what are your thoughts? Because first and foremost, some people say, oh, we need to invest heavily, but right now, the monies to invest are simply not there. Yeah. In terms of borrowing, we already are seeming to be getting overstretched in that regard. What do you think we need to do to jumpstart productivity?
Thank you very much, Maokwe. I listened to Mr. Kabweze, and I'm at a loss, really, why we still find ourselves in this precarious situation. Quantitative easing or printing money, if you use a colloquial term, is not really a problem. It's not meant to be a permanent situation, not to be a band-aid as stopgap measure in any economy. But when it becomes often, or it becomes repetitive, then it becomes a threat, as it is currently, because then, number one, there is a risk of inflation, runaway inflation. What's the inflationary rate for Nigeria right now? 18 point something, thereabouts. Then, of course, if you have, runaway inflation, and then, of course, you're going to have increase in national debt, like we have also. I remember when 1999, national debt about $36 billion, thereabouts, and it was, we made strenuous efforts, wiped off that debt. Now we're currently at $85 billion US. I lack adjectives to describe that. Yes, it's true that that represents 25% thereabouts of our GDP. So it's okay, because we have America, for instance, who has almost 100% debt to GDP ratio. But that's not the point. The point is debt to revenues. Now, as of first quarter last year, our debt revenue was around 99. Around May, it came down to about 72%, thereabouts. That's ridiculous. What economy can survive in this situation? And another, situation that, this printing of money, like I said, using this colloquial term, does, it makes economic managers to be indolent, to be lethargic. Because your last point was, how do we jumpstart or create, a seriously diversified economy, a seriously export-driven economy, because our economy is purely import-driven. We're not earning crude oil. The oil sector accounts for less than 10% of our GDP. But guess what? Accounts for about 80 to 90% of our foreign exchange earnings. Now, if you look at the other sectors of the economy, services, contributes about 55%, then industries about 18%. Why aren't we focusing on that? Let's take services, which is the highest. Agriculture about 29. So take services, which is 55% thereabouts. You have everything from the, informal sector to the artisanal to the MSMEs and all of that. Guess what? We were here about a month ago, 3 weeks thereabouts, talking about the petroleum refinery. It touched on it briefly. Do you know how much money we waste exporting crude oil and then re-importing it, using scarce FX to do that. The Port Harcourt refinery that is meant to be so-called rehabilitated with about 1.5 billion, why didn't we put maybe even half of that money to, we're talking about jump-starting the economy, creating jobs and all of that, put in social intervention programs that you and I had spoken about here, May 29, not May 29, May 2019, we were in this same studio, Marco, you and I. And I did mention that there are 3 existential threats to Nigeria. I watched that video again earlier this morning before coming here. Insecurity, number 1. Number 2, unemployment. Number 3, mass poverty. Can you tell me of these 3, which one of them hasn't gotten worse rather than abate? Because if we use $1.5 billion, and pump that money to create jobs, because generally unemployment ratio in Nigeria is about 33-point-something%, but youth unemployment is over 42%.
When you say put it in social investments,
social intervention programs,
social intervention programs,
yeah.
What's coming to my mind is not jobs.
Okay.
What is coming to my mind is palliatives and, I don't know, what we already currently have. Even though the federal government will argue that, yes, some of it is also to create jobs, but these jobs do not seem to be things that are sustainable. They look like temporary jobs. Is that the kind of...
No.
Is that what you're thinking of?
Even if, a fraction of that will go to SIPs, cash, you call them... some of those handouts, 10,000, money markets, whatever, But a substantial sum should go for MSMEs, and they create jobs. If you're going to reduce youth unemployment, or unemployment generally, if you're going to eradicate poverty in Nigeria, there's no way you're not going to do that through MSMEs. Now, what's our tax to GDP ratio? Less than 5%. Every seriously developed economy is tax-driven, not crude oil. Even nations, that are crude oil exporting nations, don't derive their economy. Their economy is not based on crude oil, revenues.
Are you willing to pay more tax?
Not tax increases, but widen the tax base. How many Nigerians are paying? I just told you the the number of Nigerians paying taxes, the tax to GDP ratio is less than 5%.
Some of the things that you have said, it
Yes.
was saying that's what the federal government has said.
That's the problem. The problem is, in Nigeria, we're all experts in terms of knowing the problem, but in terms of the solution, okay, that's where it all begins to fall apart. It's true that the tax to GDP ratio currently is, about 6.5%. The revenue to GDP is 8 to 9%. That's like 50% of the African average. So in reality, and as I talk the question you asked, are you willing to pay more taxes? In reality, those of us sitting in this room, ought to be paying more taxes. That's the reality that you see. That's the part of the discussion that nobody wants. Everybody wants to talk about what they should do, not what we should do. But if you compare our tax rate, our income tax rate, so it's not an either-or. We've got to do both. We've got to expand the number of people in the tax net, okay? And because of the gross informality of the economy, and as you've already pointed out, there's a large, poverty is, large. There are people who are currently employed, who, despite being employed, fall within the poverty threshold, which is why all those earning, the minimum wage and below are exempted from, from tax. Minimum wage is, 30,000 per month, so 360,000 per annum. If you're earning anything like that and below, you're currently exempted from tax. And so, yes, you have a number of people, but who are not taxable. Those of us who are then taxable have got to admit that we need to pay more for taxes. We need to pay more for social services. We need to deal with the issue of regressive, energy subsidies. Whether or not we like it, okay, the current pricing for petrol is not, sustainable, or look at whatever. And it's not just, first, it doesn't cover the cost of the product, you know, and then, you know,
there are huge
the
questions.
power.
There are huge
Yes.
question marks. So what a lot of people question is government sincerity in that regard. But let's quickly take this now. So Lagos, so my colleagues have questions for you, and of course, Professor Kenike.
Well, all right, let's bring in Professor Ken on this one. Good morning, Prof. Thank you for joining us today on the program.
Yeah,
well,
thank you.
Well, having listened to both gentlemen, clearly something needs to be done to put our economy in good stead. What will your immediate response be? Because we've got just a few minutes before we go to break.
Yeah, I think I'm very happy with the two gentlemen who have been speaking, and they're right on point. But I need to say on the central questions that are being addressed, that the biggest contradiction in our economy is the configuration, or what you call the structural deformity in the configuration of the downstream, mainstream, midstream, and upstream sector of our oil and gas industry. I mean, for example, why would Nigeria spend over 30 to 40% of our foreign exchange, which incidentally is about 90% coming from this sector, in just reporting products? Texas in America has more than 200 petrochemical and refineries, and it's just a fraction of what goes on in the geography of what goes on in the Niger Delta. It baffles me that the political economy in the oil and gas sector has not actually been challenged, and not least all the shenanigans going on with the PIP, and that's not what I want to go into at the moment. But I think that is the crux, because when 90% of your revenue, as small as it is in Forex, is hostage to what happens to commodity exports. There's nobody that exports commodity that makes it. I'll just tell you that. There's nobody that does that. You don't make money from just exporting raw materials, and you have no control over the price of those raw materials. And of course, when you look at the 10 biggest economies in the world, none of them depends on oil. Can't look at them, China, Japan, US, none of them, Germany, they are not built on oil. But anyway, but we have to use that oil revenue. We need to create all the states and administration and all that, but we still have to use that to begin that journey into restructuring the economy. But thank God, though, that in the last GDP report, it only accounts for 5.87% of our GDP. While in fact, technology alone, ICT alone, we're not even talking about the whole digital economy. ICT alone is 15%, which is 2.5 times the size of the oil. But the crux is that, yes, we are growing much, much faster than this business, but we're not getting the foreign exchange that we need. So we still need to address the issue of balancing our foreign exchange. And it hits the inflation because you have imported foreign inflation because of what goes on. If people can't get the money, they go to the black market, they buy it with a differential of 80 to 90 naira. They use it to import. You haven't banned the import. We haven't got the powers as such to do it. We don't want to isolate ourselves. So somehow we have to live with a diversification program, even at the export level, to enable us access foreign exchange. But that will change. The second aspect, of course, is because of the situation we have. Now, nobody even talks about the fact that we are a nation at war. And many countries that are experiencing the level of war we are experiencing.
Prof, what we'll do is we'll go to break, but we'll let you continue that train of thoughts when we return in a moment. Please stay with us. Yeah, welcome back. Well, Prof, you were making a point about the second factor, which is the security situation. Could you go ahead, please?
Right. The thing is this, as we're a nation at war in all the 6 geopolitical zones, and that has multiple impact on most macroeconomic factors that are driving the economy, not least the inflation. If we have time, we'll analyze that. Now, the thing is, we are not even imposing like 40% war tax. We have not gone out of our way to borrow, $70, $80 billion to prosecute the war. We're just managing. We're managing. And so when you say managing, where do you expect the resource? Taxable revenue is very poor, about 60 to 70% of our GDP. More African average is 18% of GDP. But the challenge is what? Over 80 million people are below poverty line. Over 100 million people can't even pay any tax. So it's just the other 100 million or so that you can hope to get money. It's tough because on paper, Nigeria looks like the lowest tax constituency in Africa. On paper. But when you look at the real tax burden, the feel like Nigeria is the highest. People have to use their own money, companies, to pay for their power generation with generators, pay for borehole, pay for truck. Is unbelievable. So you can't throw away all these or drive away all these investors because you have embarked on this kind of tax regime. So we have to see how we manage the situation. Then all of these pressures of non-diversified revenue base, external revenue base, non-diversified economic base, not exploiting, we're operating at very low potential. But having said that though, 90 million MSMEs in Africa, 45 million are from Nigeria. 50%, unbelievable, because how can Nigeria be 18% of Africa, 18% of their GDP, and we are punching at a weight of 50% of the MSMEs? It shows you that MSME is a latent competitive advantage for Nigeria. Irrespective of all our challenges, we still have a dynamic workforce and entrepreneurship that wants to drive the future economy. So how do we make sure we deliver whatever they need and we know what they need so that they can drive the growth? Now, let's come back. Let's come down to the final one. The government borrowing is still about 21% of our GDP. On the basis of international benchmarks, it should be about 40%. So we are still okay. But it is the revenue component where the debt service to GDP is running out of control. Should be around 40, but on paper it could be 50, but then by the time you administer it, if it fluctuates between 40 and 60, and it could even go to 70. But that is the reality. But please, let us also recognize that the government is just not sitting. I'm not in government, but I'm anxiously watching what they are doing. Government has created an infrastructure company. What it does is capitalizes 1 trillion. They are looking for 15 trillion capitalization naira to take away all those burden, infrastructure burden that is forcing government to go borrowing, especially externally. So that is good news. That is good news. Also, government is looking at various ways of bringing more money because, for example, national scheme, national savings schemes of that nature that will bring more money comparable, even bigger than the pension fund. They've also, from Finance Act 2020, you've seen how they triggered the setup of that trust to mop up some of those money from the unpaid dividend and what have you, just to make sure that the sources from which government can borrow internally are being diversified. And of course, the money is even safer with government because it will return that money to you any day you want it, 100%. If a bank is holding your money, which they've been doing, and then they go under, you can only get 50% from deposit insurance. So let's understand that case. So what I'm saying that there's so many other things. Government is looking at its assets right now in moving it from a dormant asset to a more active investment status so that we can begin to sweat our assets and improve liquidity in the system. Now that is creative and it's happening. I'm not singing the song of the state, but that is the things happening behind the scene. Government is doing much more than we expect. Now it comes to central bank. Under the convergence criteria of the ECOWAS monetary policy, monetary union, the central bank is not expected to put more than 10% of government financing based on their government revenue over the previous year. Yes, but we're borrowing money. We're doing the best that we can. And then, they have to provide as much support. And it's such a tough decision that they have to make. But because you have to make a choice. Do you do inflation targeting at the expense of the level of poverty, the growth and productivity? Or do you energize the economy in such a way that you get us out of crisis and then we'll come and face the reality of what we need to do to make things look sweeter? So it's a very crisis situation. Look at only one term. We only stayed in inflation in a recession only one time and we jumped out very sharp.
But Prof, you also know that in the last 5 recessions that Nigeria has entered, I mean, 3 of them have been in this administration. But if you, in terms of talking about solutions now, the questions about the revenue, funding, the budget. Now, many have raised concerns. They think that, look, if you look just in 2003, budget deficit was 16.4%, today about 40%. So in terms of solutions, what do we need to do now to ensure we don't continue in this, on this path?
But first of all, budget deficit has been within the ambit of the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007, which says to 3%, although it has marginally increased just over 3%, but the law is being amended. But we still remain the lowest in West Africa in terms of budget deficit to GDP. Many others are in 7%, Ghana is 9%.
Yeah, but
I'm not saying that we couldn't do better. Of course we can. And I have given you some examples of what government is doing to plug the hole. Look at technology is coming into the system to block the leakages. You've seen what TSA has done. It brought some discipline, and all this armchair banking is brought some discipline there. You've seen GIFMIS and how it has. You look at IPPIS, the payroll system, and ghost workers. So it is trying using technology. People are owing the company. You see contractors who are owing government coming to still collect money from other contracts. When they now come, they tell them, look, my friend, you are owing 20 billion from what technology says, and you are collecting 30 billion. Or yeah, sort us out. So technology is coming in, and that is what we have done in this National Development Plan, to put technology and innovation technology at the center stage of national planning. And that's what we've done in this new plan, 2021 to 2025, and heading out the agenda. So we are gradually using technology to replace all the shenanigans we are seeing in the oil and gas industry, and then building a new economy that will give more confidence to investors, and people who will be, even the unemployed, are going to be far more confident about the economic and political future of this country. So it's unfortunate that we had a government that doesn't actually sing his song, but I'm not saying that it is about singing song. It's about letting people know what exactly is going on. Just as you have mentioned the printing money palaver, it's just sudden confusion about printing money and creating money. You know, people just don't understand the difference between that. It is the Section 2B and Section 17 of the CBN Act confers the sole authority and right to the CBN to issue currency. It's not controvertible.
Right.
But then when you analyze, if we have time, we can come to that, because I think I have a view about this.
Okay, you raised a very important question, so I'd like to bounce this off Mr. Kabweze in Abuja. So, Mr. Kabweze, Prof said that, I mean, government should let people know what is going on. I mean, we're still trying to recover from the back and forth on this 60 billion naira that was printed by CBN or not. But for the average Nigerian out there, for the Nigerian out there, they hear government is doing this, government is doing that, but they look at the reality and what they see is way different. I mean, you've referenced inflation, headline inflation, 18%, talk about unemployment. And these are figures that are rising, not figures that dropped. They rise successively. Unemployment just over 20%, at some point it was 27, now 33%. They look at other things. We'll not even go into security because we might say that is outside your purview, definitely, but it has its impact on the economy and the SMEs as well. I mean, these are, like Prof said, they can generate way more, but I mean, the average SME out there will tell you what they have to go through just to eke out a living. So is this a case of government not doing enough to tell people what exactly is going on, or this is a case of give us a little bit more time, you might see the fruit of what we're doing?
Well, the honest truth is we're probably too busy, our hands are too full, trying to get done what needs to be done to fix this economy. And if we spend all of the time talking, we hope that with time the results will speak. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And as I said, look, it's the thing. Ultimately, people are not as interested in what you're doing as the results they get. And we understand that. So that's why we're focused on it. One of the things that we lack in this country is intellectual rigor. Just questioning. Okay, so inflation is 18%. Inflation, too much money chasing too few goods, it pushes up inflation. But when you interrogate the Nigerian inflation, first of all, food inflation is the key driver of that inflation. Food inflation is running at over 21%. So what is responsible for food inflation? Insecurity is a big contributor, because the parts of the country from where a lot of our food supply comes, a lot of the farmers can't even go to farms. Some of them some of them can't go back to harvest what they've seen. We've also got other structural factors like the wastage of the high level of wastage.
If I could just come in briefly, you just further indicted government when you mentioned...
and also even the transportation.
Pardon me, you just further indicted government when you mentioned security, insecurity being a factor in this, inflation, food inflation figure. So that's, are you saying it is the job of the people? This is still the job of the government. I just said it's maybe outside of your purview when I mentioned it earlier, but you further just said it's government responsible for this as well.
I'm not sure that is I'm not sure that is the issue here. Security is government's is the responsibility of government. The Constitution makes that very clear. But and we all know the basis for the insecurity. The armed forces say that they're doing their best is for Nigerians to judge that that. From our own side on the fiscal, our job is to try and provide as much of the resources that they require. Unfortunately, given the constraints that we have, the fiscal constraints, we're not able to provide all of the resources that the security agencies, say they need to tackle. And it's a delicate balancing thing. You've got to keep, juggling and providing. I mean, right now you've heard about the push for a supplementary budget. The security, if we're going to go ahead with a supplementary budget, security will be a key part of that. In the 13.6 trillion naira budget we have for 2021, 2.1 trillion naira of that is for security and defense. From the 13.6 trillion, that was the most we could eke out. Okay, but then it turns out not to be adequate. They need additional resources, and so. You heard Professor Ken, part of what we've got to admit, when we use the word security, insecurity, it sometimes minimizes the reality of the fact that, as Professor Ken said, that we're effectively a nation at war. And when a nation is at war, there are some things that happen, including war tax and whatever and all of that. So we've got to go back to the fact that we all need to, make a little more, sacrifices personally. If, for instance, we freed up the 1+ trillion naira on fuel subsidy, that will provide additional resources for security and for tackling some of these other problems that we allude to. We've got in 2020 we had a 502 billion naira tariff shortfall in the power sector that government, has to take responsibility for, to fund. This year, we project the tariff shortfall at 300 billion naira that government again has to take responsibility for. If we eliminated all of those, there'll be a lot more resources available. But the reality of doing that is that people like you and I will have to pay more than we currently pay for for certain things, including.
Okay, well, Mr. Kabuze, I'm wondering how many, if people even understand, what you say when you say that people need to pay more. But as you said, let's begin to look at solutions. So, Mr. Luade, one of the things that comes to my mind about this whole tax thing is the number of taxes and levies that every micro, small, and medium enterprise, as well as even the big multinationals, have to pay from time to time. Individuals pay taxes and levies. Corporations pay taxes and levies. Micro, small, and medium enterprises pay taxes and levies. That's on the one hand. On the other hand is the question of what are the things that government is doing with my taxes in a way that it will encourage me to pay more. But, you mentioned SMEs the other time, Mr. Luade. So I just want to ask you, how significant is these taxes and levies, the plethora of taxes and levies that the micro, small, and medium enterprises that you talked about the other time, how significant is the impact on their ease of doing business in a way that they can even have more confidence to pay more taxes?
Thank you very much, Ayo. And I'll answer from the last bit of your question. The joke out there amongst Nigerians is that we are individuals as we represent governments, like local governments, because we're paying for, we dig our boreholes. Over the weekend, if I were to tell you how much I spent on diesel, to power generator, you'll be stunned, and I'm sure that's the story across most Nigerian households. Now, the list is endless, so for me, asking those who pay taxes, those who are employed or businesses, industries, to pay additional taxes, I think that would be an overkill, and I think that would be unjust, because we're paying so much taxes, as it were, and what exactly do we get in return from the government? Insecurity. To move goods from parts of the country to the other part of the country on our roads, either the bandits or criminals will lay them, attack them, kill them, and all of that. A commuter, transport moving from one part of the country to the other pays taxes before they leave the park. From on the road, they meet various checkpoints. They have to pay, to service those checkpoints. Then they have to, every state you pass through, you need to pay all kinds of so-called revenue collection agencies and all of that, so that's an overkill for me. The straightforward response is to solving this debacle. Like I said, every serious economy, advanced economy that I know of in the world is tax-driven. Those economies are tax-based and tax-driven. The minimum taxes, tax to GDP is almost 40, 50, 60% in some cases. Even in some cases, almost 100%, because some of those countries they're not resource-based, natural resource-based economies. So what is the straightforward solution? Number one, like I said, it's all about jobs. Jobs. We need to create massive jobs for the unemployed Nigerians. And then, of course, number two, how do you do that? And I love that Professor Ken, if he agrees with me. We need to invest massively in the MSMEs sector. In any serious economy also, the engine of development, of growth, real growth, employment is the MSMEs. How many people are the government going to employ? Even the industries, how many people are they going to employ? It is the MSMEs, the informal sector, the services sector, agricultural sector. Those are the sectors that we need to invest in massively, to lift out people from mass poverty. And I need to say this on this channel, for as long as Nigeria has the number 190 million, in extreme poverty, this country can make any progress. Even if you bring all the billions of dollars from wherever, for as long as we don't lift out, the 100 million thereabouts, people living in extreme poverty, Nigeria can go anywhere. So let's have a master plan for poverty eradication. And then, of course, like I said, widen the tax base. And then, of course, and I'm glad the government key officer is here. We need to cut out massive wastages in government expenditure. Mr. Kabiyesi says, we have so much to do, but we don't have revenues. But even the meager revenues we have, I see massive hemorrhaging, leakages, unnecessary expenditure in both in the federal government, state governments. Let's even reduce the convoy of governors, president, ministers, and all of that. Let's remove completely some of these obscene perks and benefits of some of these, revenue generating agencies. Some of them earn maybe $1 trillion in a year, and then they spend 90% of that. and grudgingly remit to the federal government, maybe 10%. I mean, that can happen. Because we're all Nigerians, we're all patriots, we're all stakeholders in this project, Nigeria. So if a few people are earning so much money and the majority of the people are living in extreme poverty, that can be a just society. So those are my, basic thoughts. Cut out massive wastages in government expenditure.
So quickly, do you want to quickly respond to that?
Well, we're focused on trying to cut waste. There's some called efficiency unit. I think shortly they're going to be actually speaking publicly. Just to what Professor Kenny first said about government not talking about some of the initiatives. But from where I sit, when I take the budget, this 13.6 trillion naira budget, the total overhead budget for all of the over 1,200 MDAs that I have to plan for is 313.1 billion naira. For the 60 government-owned enterprises, 63 government-owned enterprises whose budgets are mainstreamed, is another 312.9. Between the two, that's 626 billion naira. That's 5% of the budget, size. So if I made that zero, it still doesn't move on my fiscal challenge. So there are people dealing with all of those, whatever, and yes, there is wastage. The next thing someone will say, oh yeah, the assembly budget, but that's less than 1% of the total. If I made that zero, it doesn't solve my problem. It's not to say we should not focus on those things, but I'm saying even those are not the things that will deliver the solution.
What will make a big
deliver
impact?
The solution is we've got to grow the revenue base of this economy. Look, we talk about agriculture being well over 20% of GDP. In terms of contribution to government revenue is under 1%. Services sector 50 plus percent because of the structure of those. The services sector that we talk about is largely artisanal, informal, the low level of informality. That's why you look at under the economic sustainability plan, you see government offering free registration to these guys, offering incentives so 1 million SMEs or more just come and register, finding some whatever. We've got to increase the formality of this, of this economy, so that you can all those people can become visible to the tax, and that's part of how you can sit there. So otherwise, it's not going to.
What about the states? Are you co-opting the states along in this journey?
Yes, the Joint Tax Board, working together now. That's why you now have a unified national tax ID number.
Because when you look at
which every taxpayer in the country is saying, and there's a uniform tax base.
When you look at the fact that a lot of states are dependent on FAC, if there is no FAC allocation, they will be broke, as it were. A lot of people will say that we should also be, and that's where the action is happening in the states. The people live in the states. The question is, how can we co-opt the states to ensure that they are also on board and also trying to get productivity going on in their own states as well?
Well, I mean, I'm one person that believes that there's no state in this country that is not potentially viable. It's for, the people who run those, states, the economies, to basically, put on their thinking cap. Once I had to speak to one of the states. I said, you think you have nothing? And I gave them the example of Nevada, a state, in this arid land, desert land, no whatever. They built an economy on sin. I was not, me, I wouldn't be an advocate of whatever. But, so Nevada's economy is built on what's called sinning. Come and sin, but we'll make the money off you. And they created a massive economy out of nothing. So people just need to think whatever. But again, IGR doesn't grow on nothing. So people say, oh, the state's IGR. You've got to create an economic base in the state. For people, for people to, if people are not engaged in economic activity, they have no taxable income. It's not the taxes of civil servants. In many of those states, they call them civil service states, because almost everybody is employed by government. There's hardly any presence of... So we must get to competitive fiscal federalism where the states can compete for industry, to attract industry. And you know, in other federations, states, the federal has, you know, corporate and personal taxes. The states have corporate and personal taxes. And so they can use policy to attract, and we have a unified sort of system here.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. We're totally out of time. I've been trying to see if we could wrap this up or wrap it up well as well. But we have to thank you, gentlemen, for coming on Sunrise Today this morning. Mr. Ben Akabweze is the Director General of the Budget Office. Mr. Wale Oluwade is the CEO of Growth Masters Consulting. And we also heard from Professor Ken Ife on Zoom, who's a macroeconomic policy analyst. Well, that's it for this segment. We have to thank you all for coming. Sunrise Today continues to take on another matter in a moment. Please stay with us.